Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways you can address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is developing a business case for change. A business case identifies the anticipated benefits of a change initiative and the investment required to implement it. Benefits include increased sales, profit, and market share, decreased costs, greater customer service, and retention of talent. These gains need to be greater than the investment of resources required to secure them, mainly money, time, skills, and leadership attention. So, how do you create a business case for change to activate your chosen strategies to achieve organizational goals? My guest today is David Vivenes. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Phil. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here, David. David has over 25 years of marketing experience in packaged goods, food and beverage, and entertainment industries. He was the chief marketing officer at Yum Restaurants and currently leads global marketing, communications, and customer experience for Woodbine Entertainment. David, what is your experience with developing business cases for change?
Through my career, I've been pretty fortunate to work with some good organizations across some pretty different businesses, as you touched on. So early in my career, I was at Coca-Cola and at Procter & Gamble with Pampers. Later on, I worked on the candy business at Cadbury, where we had the pleasure to meet for the first time. And then I worked in quick service restaurants like KFC. And now I'm in the exciting world of sports entertainment and racing and sports betting. And I got to tell you, Phil, I feel like through all of that, change has been the only constant. And of course, when there is change, there is a need for compelling business cases to back that change up and to align the organization. So I can tell you a quick story on this. When I started my career with Procter & Gamble, one of the very first projects I worked on, and I was completely, wet behind the ears, just coming into the world of business, it was to lead the transformation of a highly profitable local brand that Procter & Gamble had acquired in another market, and they had a 70% market share with this brand. And what the company wanted to do was to completely rebrand it into the global Pampers brand. And of course, like companies do, the mandate was do not lose a single customer or a single dollar in the process. So I was very fortunate, Phil, that P&G is actually renowned for coaching and empowering junior people, like I was at the time, to lead complex business initiatives early on. And they're also known for teaching a great degree of rigor and discipline in developing business cases. And I have to say that has served me really well in my career. I've worked on a lot of brand and business transformations since then. We've had to either reimagine the company or a brand or a business model to drive big step changes in results. And it's been really exciting and really rewarding.
Great. And P&G, as you know, they're so acclaimed in so many things, from training to developing talent, having the best talent and quality, but they're also known for being process driven. Did that help you in the sense of having one way of doing something, almost like the famous P&G, how to write an email, and just working that system within different contexts, but following the same steps?
Yeah, it's a great question, Phil. I think that when I joined P&G, I read a book that interviewed a lot of people who had started their career at P&G and had moved on to other endeavors in life. And in hindsight, it's so much of what those folks said resonates with me, which is a lot of that discipline learned early on, and then having the freedom to apply it in your own work life as you continue from there was very powerful. Actually, Procter & Gamble has a very, even I think to this day, the famous one-page memo. So you have to fit into a one page, pretty much everything that relates to a business case or a recommendation. Now you can have a few exhibits, financials and the like, forecasting and so on. But fundamentally, the components of the business case are the same. If I take a step back, Bill, I would say that to me, a business case, and I'm going to quote here, being a marketer, the slogan of a great advertising agency, McCann Erickson. And to me, a good business case is what they would call truth well told. Right. So it is the truth, it is the facts, it is the components of it. So the what of the story, and then there's the how you tell that story. And I think how you present that truth, ultimately, you're going to emphasize some elements more versus others. And that may vary a little bit based on the culture of the organization, or maybe even based on the metrics that the organization is most focused on. But I do think that there are a few key components of a good business case. And I would put them big picture into two big buckets. I would say one big bucket is what I call sort of the hard components of how you structure your business case. And it very much drives or comes from that discipline from Procter & Gamble we were talking about. It's the various sections of the business case, right? And then how they flow. You start with the purpose and then you go from there into your rationale and everything else. But how they flow and connect to one another is what ultimately adds up to a compelling and convincing story. And then the second big bucket to my mind is the soft elements. And I don't think those are actual sections in your business case, but they sort of permeate throughout the business case. And they're really kind of the how you tell that story, right? I think they're critical to get your audience on board and to present a convincing case that people rally behind, because people also support people. They don't just support a piece of paper, right?
I love your point about people support people. Sort of that art of storytelling is very hot these days, but I think it's always been relevant throughout the ages. In talking about the soft elements and how it flows and creating that story, and I've seen you do amazing stories in our past together. Could you tell the listeners how that works and how do you make a good story that is compelling versus a bit of a transactional one?
Yeah, the answer is probably in those two big buckets that I talked about. And I think the sections of the business case really are the story itself, the what it is that you're telling. And that in itself has to be robust, has to be withstand scrutiny. At the end of the day, we all put a lot of effort into it, but there is some magic to how you present that. And the story that you tell, to me, starts with a clear purpose. You are recommending a change initiative. The fundamental question is why. And that why, that purpose needs to be very clear. Then you need to kind of present your facts, the background, if you will, the data, and so on, in a way that relates to the strategic objectives of the company. And that starts painting a picture of where there's gaps and where there's a need for change. After that, you need to be very clear on what your proposal is, what specific recommendations you have. And sometimes, I've seen it many times that is a little bit muddied, right? There's a bit of an idea there, but it's not sharp. So you need to be very sharp on that. I think then you need to support that with what P&G would call your rationale or your key reasons for this recommendation. And then you can ideally anticipate questions also. And I think this is very powerful, especially in today's world, maybe even more so than when I started. You need to be prepared to have a conversation. Success is not an audience just listening to you and rubber stamping or not rubber stamping. It's actually engaging in a productive discussion. I think anticipating their questions and areas of concern, outlining risks and how you intend to mitigate those risks, speaking about other alternatives that you consider, and then top lining your action plan from there and why this alternative that you're proposing is the best one is very powerful. So that's really the story. Now, not to neglect those softer elements that I spoke about before. I think in the how you tell that story, I think that's kind of like the secret sauce, Phil, right? And it's easy to neglect it. Again, as a marketer, I'll summarize them in a catchy shorthand of the 3 C's of conviction, commitment, and collaboration are the 3 things that I stand out for me. So if you think about those 3, conviction, commitment, and collaboration, they're really about what your audience, what your decision makers want to hear, right? They want to see your conviction and your passion that this change is needed, right? That the status quo is not acceptable. Always the default is do nothing, keep things as they are. It takes less money, less effort, and so on. But if you bring the conviction and the passion that that's not acceptable and that there's a better future state, then that's going to be very important. After that, before writing a check, whether that's money or people or time or what have you, they want to hear your commitment to the goals and to executing with excellence, right? Some people approach goals as a bit of a dream kind of approach, right? And it's not about that, right? These need to be tangible goals that you can stand behind, and they want to hear your commitment to those. And that's why you need to know your stuff. You need to be able to have an intelligent conversation about where your numbers come from and why these are realistic, maybe a pessimistic, realistic, and optimistic scenario, those kinds of things. The final C is that the collaboration. And this is actually a very powerful one. And I think today more than ever, in my experience, nothing gives more comfort, I guess I should say, to a stakeholder than listening to a cross-functional group of leaders who are clearly aligned behind a common goal. They've looked at it through different lenses, through their own functional lenses, and they have worked on it together, and they're singing from the same songbook. Because at the end of the day, the people who approve the business cases are not as into the specifics of the business as this group of leaders presenting the recommendation are. And if they see a wide range of cross-functional leaders have rallied together and are proposing this, that has a tremendous power, I think, as well.
That's a great one. And that's I would say, the biggest gap I've seen when watching business cases for change, that they tend to be functional. So if it's a new product, it's all about, the new product, but finance hasn't been brought in, feasibility analysis. If it's, commercial versus supply chain, how do you get the cross-functional people to be aligned before you actually present?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways, right? So the traditional way is some people sort of try and sell other functions into what they're trying to do, right? So enroll support that way. I'm a big believer, and this is something that I had learned throughout my career, but particularly when I was at Yum. David Novak, who was the founder CEO of Yum Restaurants, and again the parent company of KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut, they spun off from Pepsi about 20 years ago. And he wrote a book called Taking People With You. And there's some very powerful thoughts there, but fundamentally, if I were to, super simplify it, I would say there's something to be said for spending the time with people, listening to them, and really sincerely integrating their thoughts and having their thoughts help shape your own and shape your recommendations. And if you do that, and if you do that well, and you take the time to do it well, then what happens is actually, the risk of sounding corny, it's a bit magical, right? It is, people feel that they have skin in the game. They feel this is not Phil's recommendation anymore. It's our recommendation because we had a conversation, and now I, David, feel that you, Phil, have integrated my thoughts into it. So now what's moving forward, it's not necessarily what you came in with. It probably is fundamentally still what you came in with, but it has the coloring of the value I was able to have. And then my ability and my willingness to support you in front of anyone, because now I have skin in the game, because now you're representing our collective view, is fundamentally increased. And that's a much more powerful way to enroll cross-functional support than, I guess, the traditional kind of go around meeting people and tell them, I want to do this, can I get your support kind of thing, right?
No, sir. You mentioned earlier in our conversation about building in potentially some of the objections. Would that be your preference as well? So that if supply chain was perhaps challenged by inventory levels of packaging and you want to change a brand, would you put that into the narrative?
Absolutely. That's a great point, Phil. Yes, actually, I think the risks, the alternative scenarios offer you sort of a great opportunity to look across the various implications that a change initiative has across the organization, and to let the experts speak. And the important thing is not just to state what the risks are, but is to state what you're going to do about them. And frankly, as a marketer, I always sort of use one of the mantras that I use for myself and for my team was that I always wanted to be the second most knowledgeable person in the room about any function, right? So there's going to be a sales expert, or there's going to be an operations expert or a finance expert. I want to know the second most about those things than they do. And that speaks to whether I was able to achieve that or not is a different question. But I think that speaks to being really intellectually curious and spending the time with them and let their voices come across in the risk assessments and in how to best manage those and so on. And I think what you end up benefiting in so many ways, right? Because the business case becomes so much stronger. But in addition to that, you as a leader experience so much growth from just, that experience as well.
Any thoughts about once the business case is done and it's approved, how do you translate that into language, which is so critical in change, so that it is relevant?
Yeah, well, I think actually something that I've gotten better at through my career is this notion of storytelling that we're talking about. And that's what most people, organizations, and people throughout organizations can buy into, is the stories, right? The common purpose that I spoke about as well is very important, right? Because people connect to a vision, they connect to a purpose. And if you paint a compelling vision of the future, they want to be a part of that. It can be a very powerful thing, but you need to make it simple. Not because, and this is not meant to be, sort of a patronizing comment that others will not understand or what. It's not about that. It's really about the fact that people are busy, right? They have a lot of other things, and your change is just an additional, your change initiative, whatever it may be, is just another thing that they need to support, that they need to work on. So you need to be able to tell the story, to paint the picture of the future, to tell the story in a compelling way, and to boil it down to fundamentally what it is about. Not everyone needs to know everything. So you need to tailor to different audiences as well, right? I spent many years in the world of packaged goods. And that is something that also we developed early on as a skill set, was how would we get, for example, the sales force excited and enrolled on a change initiative, right? On that whole. And, salespeople are great. I have many friends that are salespeople. They can be a bit skeptical, right? They can be a bit cynical, right? And understandably so, because they are there in the front line and taking a little bit of crap from the big guns in this world, the big retailers or whatever, who will challenge them. So naturally, they look at anything that you look at or that you bring to them with a bit of a questioning look, right? And they
Certainly.
try and make sure they interrogate it and that it's solid. But if you can tell them the story in a compelling way, if you can also tell them how this is going to help them become more successful, then it can be very powerful, right? For example, when we were together at Cadbury and I had the opportunity to work on this very exciting initiative of transforming and reinventing our candy business there, a big part of the story was the story of Cadbury becoming the leading total confectionery company in Canada. Right? So a company that had a whole portfolio of brands across the various categories that comprise confectionery, right? From chocolate to gum to candy and so on, seasonal products and so on. Well, the reality is that you cannot be successful in that and you cannot sell that to your customer for them to support you if you're a salesperson, if you don't have strength across the board. So you find a common purpose through that, and then you work with them on how we tailor that story and how we make it simple for them, and then ultimately for them to communicate to external customers, right?
No, that's great. And actually, I remember that I was doing a dual role and I was the VP of HR commercial at that time. And I remember being in the meeting and there was a period of sort of grilling, I would say, to you and your team. How do you go about managing that situation?
I think a lot of it goes back to the discipline that you do before coming into the room. A lot of people think about, and you're right. I mean, listen, presenting a business case can be an intense kind of experience, right? You feel you're on the line, your reputation, you want to stand out. You're probably an ambitious person who wants to, this to be something, points on the board for you in your career and so on. But the reality is that as important as that presentation is, it's not all about that day. Really, a lot of the work happens before that day, right? And it goes back to what we were talking about, and I'm not going to repeat myself, but having that structure from the purpose on down to your rationale, et cetera, worked out, to having looked at the alternatives, to having the cross-functional support enrolled. If you have all of that present, then your ability to be in the moment, people talk a lot about mindfulness these days, right? So your ability to be in the moment because you have all your due diligence and really engage on a productive business conversation rather than feeling that anything that is being asked is going to poke holes and just, the case is going to, fall like a house of cards kind of thing. Being able to not worry about that, but actually staying in the moment and having a productive discussion about the scenarios that you consider or not. And frankly, listen, if management through a question uncover that there's a potential way to look at this that you hadn't thought about, that's okay. That's what the role is. But I think that all that diligence is ultimately what enables you to have a good conversation in the room. Now, management can ask tough questions, right? And I've been asked some challenging questions myself over time. I think a lot of it is to think about it from the audience perspective. We all do this, and senior management is no different. When you're asking a question, sometimes it's not the question literally that you're asking, it's the question behind the question, right? And if you are in the moment, you can try and identify, why are they asking me that? And then you can bring it back to the structure of your business case and to all the pre-work that you have done going in.
And just to continue on with that example and your point about having really a cross-functional collective that's supporting and recommending this, there's one question that came your way, and I believe it was the head of sales answer for you. And I think you can't get better than that when the team is answering the questions that you're faced versus yourself, which is probably even more credible than if you try to do so yourself.
When they are asking questions, tough questions, I can think of, tough questions that I've been asked, right? I remember in one instance being asked, if this is such a good idea, how come no one has ever done it before? Right? They're probably not looking for you to talk about how brilliant you are in uncovering something no one has ever seen, right? That's not the answer they're looking for. Or when they're asking you, can you guarantee that we're going to get these results? It's a tough question, right? Can you guarantee it? You don't want to waffle, but you know that there's no absolute guarantees, right? It's business. So, they're probably not looking for you to say, absolutely, yes, I can guarantee it. Where do I sign, right? I think, their questions, as we were saying, they're not so much literal, but they actually, what they're looking is to probe onto sort of why should we do the change? What they're really asking is, why should we go through the change? Why should we not simply keep things the way they are? Because management fundamentally is allocating resources and priorities to the organization. Those are the decisions they make multiple times a day. So it does go back to that and the natural resistance that we talked about before. But also they're looking to test you on some of these areas and behaviors that we spoke about before. One thing that clicked for me partway through my career was the fact that senior management doesn't know my business as well as I do. But what they do know is that what they are doing and what they do know is that you need to have done your due diligence. And if you can demonstrate that, to your point, if your cross-functional partners can actually speak and answer questions with the same voice that you would, that gives them confidence that there's cross-functional support and enrollment, that it's not just for show, right? That you didn't just invite a couple of people cross-functionally to sit around the table and be quiet, right? Just because they give a sense of cross-functionality. So they feel that. If they ask you a question about, can you guarantee these projections? You can be honest. You can say, well, I believe there are some risks to these projections, and here they are, and here's how we intend to mitigate those. But we're very confident that this is a profitable opportunity for the organization. And we're very confident that even in our worst case scenario that we've analyzed, this is worth the investment and effort that the organization and resources that the organization is going to put in. So that conviction, that collaboration, that commitment that I spoke about before, a lot of the times the questions that are being asked are about that. Now, obviously, there's always going to be technical questions, and that's also where your cross-functional team can be very powerful in helping you address those.
Have you ever faced the leader that just does not buy in, or they have almost an allergic reaction to your recommendation? She or he is saying, I don't buy this or whatever. How do you manage that when you have most of them, but there's just one naysayer that just can't get over their go-in position, let's say?
Yeah, well, listen, I think something we haven't talked, we talked a little bit about it, I guess, is that many leaders make the mistake of thinking that the day you present the business case is the big day, right? It's the big reveal when all the hard work comes to life and the audience will be in awe, right? And we'll go like, oh my God, this is so amazing. Where do I sign up, right? And it really shouldn't be any of those things. You really should come into the room having pre-aligned pretty much everyone before you walk into it. And you want to have as many supporters and advocates as possible. And when you do that, even if, let's say, you were not able because you're not close enough or you couldn't make the time or whatever, right? And the head of a certain function or a member of the board or whatever, you were not able to pre-align. And they are, to your point, an objector, and they are sort of, poking holes here and there. If you have done your job of aligning not only your cross-functional team, but also aligning a lot of the audience, of the ones that are ultimately going to approve your recommendation, you're going to have advocates in the room, and they will help you bring any sort of, one-off dissenters, I guess, on board. Now, is there always a chance that things go sideways a little bit and you need to do some follow-ups with this individual afterwards to dig deeper into some areas of concern of theirs? Of course, it's business, it happens one way or another. But I think if you come in armed with that pre-work of having pre-aligned people, having supporters and advocates, and of having incorporated the ideas and the thoughts from other functions into your business case and so on, those advocates are going to be right there with you, and they're going to help you drive the change forward, not only outside in the real world where the work needs to happen, but also in the room.
What's the biggest blind spot or the biggest gap that you've seen over watching someone else present?
Yeah, wow, there's a few, I could more easily give you probably a quick list here.
Please do.
Feel that I would the one big thing. I think this last one that we talked about is one big thing of this idea of pre-alignment. I think not connecting the business case clearly enough to the strategic objectives of the company is a big one. Sometimes we all get enamored with our own, functional agenda or what have you, and we get excited. And ultimately, the role of senior management, who is ultimately approving these business cases for change, is to drive the overall agenda of the company, and that's represented in those strategic objectives. So you need to make sure you connect back to those. I think that would be one. I think we spoke a little bit about this one, but I'll repeat it because it does bear repeating. Not being thorough enough in assessing alternative approaches or risks inherent to your initiative, or maybe even assessing them, but not being clear or overt enough about those with your audience. I do find, and I've seen this different times in my career, and I've even seen them from different levels in the organization, is that people feel sometimes compelled to paint an overly rosy, optimistic picture of the future state in the hopes that that will get the audience to buy in. And I think that's it's not the way I approach things. And I think that it's ultimately a mistake. I equate it a little bit to when a sports team signs an aging star player to come and join their team. I'm reminded of, I'm a big Raptors fan, back in the day. I'm dating myself perhaps to some younger Raptors fans here, but back in the day, they signed Hakeem Olajuwon, one of the NBA greatest, right, of all time. And they did what they call in that environment, they won the press conference, right? So you're winning the day, but you're not winning ultimately long term because this person has nothing left in the tank, right? The notion of not painting an overly rosy picture, but being very truthful about the alternatives and the risks and all that, and ultimately what you're going to be able to deliver is very important. We talked a little bit about organizational culture, right? So I think that not thinking hard enough about how you're going to lean into the culture of the organization to build momentum and make the change stick and be sustainable. I mean, you are the expert amongst us on this, but I would say that a big part of driving change is not only getting approval up front to the business case, but is actually making the change stick and be sustainable over time, right? And not fizzle out. So I think that that's where being very intentional and deliberate, as we spoke about how you're going to lean into the culture of the organization, is an important watch out. And the last one, and connected to something we also touched on briefly, is road testing your business case, right? So not road testing it enough is a watch out. It can translate into questions that you're stomped on in the room that you shouldn't be, right? And it's happened. It's happened to all of us. And nothing, I'll grant you, I'm a little bit obsessive about these things, but it's no fun to be driving home after having presented a business case and getting a question and being stumped and sort of replaying that scene in your mind all the way home.
If you're forced with creating a quick business case for change, you could only do one thing that would sort of set it up to have the greatest probability of success, what would that activity be so that you would be in your best position to present?
If nothing else, you can take the principles of that storytelling and apply them into a much simpler version of that. And I think if you just stick to those principles, you're going to have a case that, maybe it's not airtight, strictly speaking, but it's compelling and it's convincing, which is ultimately what you want. So if you can connect to a clear purpose and to the goals of the organization, and you can paint a picture of why there's a gap today and why this approach paints a better future for the organization delivering against those goals than the current state does. And if you can enroll some cross-functional partners along the way, even if that comes from a hallway conversation and getting them excited about supporting you on this, that can be enough, right? There's, change initiatives come in all sizes and colors. And some of them are frankly, deserving of a much faster, nimble approach. But I think that if you stick to those principles, you certainly can be successful.
Great advice, David. Thank you. And is there one point or a watch out or a recommendation for our listeners that you just like to leave our conversation off with and that you think would be the most help?
If we are convinced, committed, and we drive that collaboration that I spoke about, we are going to be viewed in a much more positive light than the majority of business cases that are presented out there. The amount of times that I see a business case come through where people have not done that, and therefore they sort of stumble at the first kind of question, or as soon as someone double clicks a little bit and asks one question one level deeper, they struggle with that, is too many to count. So I wouldn't worry about we need to beat this particular initiative or that particular initiative. I think your role as a leader is focusing on how you and the team that surrounds you can drive benefit for the organization. But I think that in your ambition to get support for the change that you want to drive, the most fundamental thing, the secret sauce for driving that, is not only the what the story is, but the how you tell that story, as I said earlier.
No, thank you. Thanks very much for sharing. And thanks very much for being on the Change on the Run podcast. I really appreciate you sharing your perspectives. And how can people get in contact with you?
Well, thank you, Phil, for having me. First of all, I think it's a terrific initiative. Very excited about the book as well. It's all very, very exciting, and it's a privilege to have been on your podcast. Yeah, listen, I'm open for people to contact me via LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way for folks to reach out, and happy to network with people and talk about these or any other things that may be of interest.
Great. Thanks again, David. And I'd also like to thank our producer, Charlie Buckley, and thank you for listening. And if you're interested in learning more about the Change on the Run book that is launching on March 2nd with pre-sale bonuses available February 2nd, go to changeontherun.com. And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.